What did the disciples think Jesus meant when he warned them about the leaven of the Pharisees? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Mark on Walking Through the Bible.
The glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Mark chapter 8. We're going to be reading from verses 11 to 21. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Mark chapter 8, beginning at verse 11. Then the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. But he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly, I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation." And he left them, and getting into the boat again, departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than one loaf with them in the boat. Then he charged them, saying, "Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And when they reasoned among themselves, saying, "It is because we have no bread." But Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, "Why do you reason, because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you take up?" They said to him, 12. "Also, when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of fragments did you take up?" And they said, 7. So he said to them, "How is it that you do not understand?" From everything we can tell, Jesus is still in the region of Dalmanutha on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. It is here that the Pharisees come to Jesus seeking a sign. They were not seeking a sign because they wanted to believe in Jesus. They were seeking a sign from heaven, testing him. In other words, they were trying to get Jesus to prove that he was from heaven by using his power. This is not an attitude we're to have. If the Pharisees wanted to know that Jesus was from heaven, they could have simply looked at the things he had already done. No further proof is needed. But no, they wanted Jesus to put on a show, something Jesus refused. Jesus said that this generation would receive no sign. Now in our study of Matthew in chapter 16, Jesus gives us the same words with Jesus' exception concerning the prophet Jonah. Why does Mark leave this sign out while Matthew included? While we cannot be sure for certain, if you recall from our study of Matthew, when Jesus spoke of the sign of the prophet Jonah in chapter 16, this wasn't the first mention of it in that gospel. It was also mentioned in Matthew 12, a teaching that the Pharisees also heard. Mark excludes this story from his gospel. So it is therefore quite likely that Mark left out Jesus' exception here in order not to have to explain to his readers what that sign meant, an explanation that Jesus didn't give here. So again, we see that the Gospels aren't simply carbon copies of each other. Some information is added, other information is left out, and when we read each Gospel separately and then put them all together, we get a complete picture of the ministry of Jesus. From here, once again, Jesus and the disciples get into the boat to cross the Sea of Galilee. From our previous readings about the conditions on the side of the sea, we know that there is plenty of desert places where there is not many opportunities to buy food. And yet, here you have the disciples crossing the sea, bringing only 1 loaf of bread. Now, Jesus knew that the disciples didn't bring enough bread with them, and so it is quite likely that he used this analogy here to test the faith of the disciples. He said that they were to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Matthew omits the leaven of Herod and instead inserts the leaven of the Sadducees, a fact that Mark omits. Again, this is not a contradiction, just another point of view from which to tell the story. To understand what Jesus is talking about, we must recall that up to this point in his ministry, Jesus had pointed out the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and dangers of following after the leaders of that day, for they weren't teaching or practicing the truth. However, he had not used this analogy about leaven in this way as far as we can tell. Thus, that he chose to use it here when the disciples were thinking about bread is why it is likely that he did so to test their faith. And naturally, with the disciples overly concerned about bread, they didn't understand Jesus' meaning, thinking he was chastising them for bringing no bread and warning them about the bread that the Pharisees and Herod might have. Of course, he was doing no such thing. But seeing their lack of faith, asking them why they thought that forgetting to bring bread would have posed a problem to Jesus. Did they not remember when he fed the 5,000 with 5 loaves, how many baskets they took up? Did they not remember when he fed the 4,000 with 7 loaves, how many baskets they took up? Would it therefore be a problem to Jesus and to God to provide for them if such became necessary? Jesus' words here again show us that the feeding of the 5,000 and feeding of the 4,000 were two separate miracles, not repetitions or revisions of the same story. Instead, he tells them that he wasn't speaking about bread, but was saying that they need to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Mark leaves us wondering if the disciples ever understood, but Matthew would tell us that having been told that Jesus wasn't speaking about bread, the disciples now recognize that he was speaking figuratively, with the leaven representing the doctrines and practices of the Pharisees and Herod. Leaven, of course, is what is used to raise bread. Only a little leaven is needed in a large lump of dough to produce this effect during baking, and so Jesus is warning his disciples not to accept even the smallest form of false doctrine, for it will grow and affect their beliefs in other areas. For us today, sometimes we think if we accept a little religious error, that it either won't affect us personally or it won't affect our standing before God. Jesus' lesson to the disciples is therefore a lesson for us as well. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Mark chapter 8, verses 22 to 26, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.